Um, Thank you. So the title of the presentation really speaks to um, the reality that we have become accustomed to using plastic, and yet there are health harms that are associated with plastic, and so much that we need to do about it. So before I begin the scientific presentation, I just need to disclose that I have written a book about endocrine disrupting chemicals, and insofar as that I've received honoraria for that reason, um, you might perceive that as a potential conflict of interest. Great. So plastics are such an important part of healthcare. As a pediatrician, we intubate little babies to give them um, fats that are crucial for lung function in prematurity. We pump and deliver breast milk through plastic tubing, and we deliver life-saving medications such as albuterol inhaler through plastic tubing. Yet we know that we have an exponential growth in plastic production and consumption, and on a broader scale. We know that there are only 3 pauses in the exponential production of plastic globally: the 1970s oil crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, and the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. And in particular, the exponential growth in plastic production is happening now in low and middle income countries. We need to acknowledge that plastic ultimately comes from fossil fuel feedstocks. To make polyethylene plastic, first we extract ethane from crude oil, we crack it into ethylene, and then we polymerize it. Similarly, we use natural gas to make propane, then crack it into propylene, and then make polypropylene polymers from that monomer. And to make polyvinyl chloride, we make vinyl chloride from ethylene, and then polymerize it. And as attention to climate change has prompted a focus on reducing fossil fuel burning, many companies globally are shifting from using fossil fuels to make energy to make plastic. Now, this increase in plastic production and consumption on an exponential scale has literally put the planet in a proverbial plastic bag. The crisis it has created has 3 dimensions. There are ecosystem effects, it has contributed to climate change, and the chemicals and microplastics have contributed to adverse consequences for human health. I'll address each of these one by one. We know that we have been unable to recycle plastics despite what the industry has told us about recycling. Even under the best circumstances, perhaps 30% or 40% of plastic in practice can be recycled. Cumulatively, only 9% of all plastic has ever been recycled. And when we don't recycle plastic, there are essentially 2 final fates for that plastic. It finds its way into landfills, such as pictured here, or it is burnt. When it finds its way into wildlife, the consequences for animals can be visible and invisible. So you can see the picture of a straw being caught in the nostril of a sea turtle, but these are not the only consequences of plastic for wildlife. The invisible consequences may be equally profound. The effects of microplastic described for wildlife can include inflammation, disruption of the microbiome, and changes in gene expression. We know that this problem will only get bigger with time. You can see on the left the projected generation of plastic waste globally. And on the right, you can see the length of the life cycle of plastic products. And even though there is a number in the recycling triangle, the life of these plastics can be forever. Forgive me, I've removed the speaker box so that you can see the entire slide. My apologies. Now, one of the issues when you have a plastic particle that starts in the environment is that there are chemical changes that occur just from contact with nature. Ultraviolet light can change the covering of plastic, making it more easily for byproducts to emerge in the environment. And so further contact with the environment adds stress to the plastic, and then contact with water leads to the release of multiple components of the plastic byproducts. This can lead to organic compounds directly absorbing into water, and then polymers break down into varying degrees of length, with microplastics being defined as less than 5 millimeters in length, and nanoplastics described as smaller particles ranging from less than 1 micrometer, 1/1000th of a meter, to particles that are 1/10 the size. And on the right, you can see the scenarios for marine pollution with microplastics. And unless we bend the exponential plastic growth curve, these emissions will grow exponentially over time. It's also important to emphasize that plastics contribute to climate change. Right now, greenhouse gas emissions from plastic comprise 4% of the total. And the UN Climate Change Panel anticipates that percent to increase to 20% of the total by 2040. And as plastics wear down due to ultraviolet light, they release even more greenhouse gases. We know that accidents can also increase plastic release into the environment. In the United States, we had a tragic derailment of a train carrying vinyl chloride. And when you burn plastic materials, you often create dioxin, a very potent carcinogen. So in this disaster in East Palestine, Ohio, we saw an increase in dioxin emissions in the soil. And unfortunately, we've seen the soil levels exceed the threshold for risk of cancer set by the Environmental Protection Agency. And we've seen other disasters where plastic is burnt that creates dioxin. In the World Trade Center disaster, we found increases in dioxin levels in relationship to exposure among pregnant women. So in general, burning plastic as a way to get rid of plastic waste is just generally not a good idea. And when we get to human exposure, the issues are similar to those experienced in wildlife. There are two main groups of exposure to plastic. First, we have the microplastics and nanoplastics, just the way they occur in the marine environment. And then we have chemicals that dissolve into human tissues. These are not only the monomers of plastic polymer, but they are also the additives used in the processing and creation of plastic products. I'll focus first on the organic chemicals and then come back to the effects of microplastics in humans. We know that there are 16,000 chemicals used in plastics. We know nothing about the health effects in 2/3 of them. And we know that there are multiple different effects of these chemicals, whether it's to wildlife or to our hormonal systems. What concerns me the most as I make this presentation is that I will only describe the effects of perhaps less than 200 of the entire 16,000 chemicals used in plastic. And yet there are so many health effects of concern that we already are aware of. We will focus on this presentation on 5 categories of chemicals. And we'll focus in particular on the effects of these chemicals on our hormones, our signaling molecules. Bisphenols are used in polycarbonate plastics as well as aluminum can linings. Phthalates are used in personal care products, cosmetics, and food packaging. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances are used in nonstick cooking materials and oil and water-resistant clothing. Bromine and phosphorus-based flame retardants are added to many plastics to prevent them from burning. And we've already discussed the effects of dioxins. We know that chemicals can disrupt our hormone signaling systems that are important to basic biological functions. These include temperature, metabolism, salt, sugar, and even sex. And we know that there are over 1,000 chemicals that can disrupt these hormone functions and thereby contribute to disease and disability. One of the reasons why this field has exploded in interest is that we've appreciated that the problem of endocrine disrupting chemicals is much bigger than we anticipated. That's because chemicals used in plastic don't have to look like hormones to have their effects on human health. They can change how certain genes are expressed. These are genes that are important to basic biological functions. And now we appreciate that hormone functions are not just important for the gonads and for the thyroid gland, that the brain, muscle, and heart are all affected by the endocrine system. On the right, you see in English a representative list of these chemicals. So the chemicals we're talking about when we're talking about endocrine disrupting chemicals are not just used in plastic. They're also increasingly used in pesticides and herbicides. And we know that metals can disrupt hormone function. And there are also natural molecules that disrupt hormone functions. The issue is that synthetic disruptors of hormone function have exponentially grown in exposure, while these natural disruptors have not. The effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals were first described in the landmark 2009 Endocrine Society scientific statement. Soon thereafter, the World Health Organization and United Nations Environment Program called endocrine disrupting chemicals a global public health threat. This report was widely debated in the peer-reviewed literature, but in the end was officially welcomed in 2015 by the UN body on chemicals. The only concern was left in a footnote that suggested that the only disagreement came from the pesticide and chemical industries. And in that same year, the Endocrine Society published a second scientific statement on endocrine disrupting chemicals. And the rapid explosion and the rapid development of a second scientific statement speaks to the explosion of scientific evidence that has emerged rapidly since the 2009 report. This document has 1,331 scientific references, many of which directly document in human studies the effects that have been previously described in animal and laboratory studies. Afterwards, multiple scientific and government bodies have reinforced the scientific understanding about the effects of chemicals used in plastic. These include the International Federation of Gynecologists and Obstetricians, which documents patient-facing guidance. The U.S. American Academy of Pediatrics has emphasized the serious concerns that these chemicals pose because they get into food. The World Obesity Federation has documented the need for policy action on endocrine disrupting chemicals to prevent obesity and diabetes. And most recently, the National Academy of Sciences suggests routine clinical testing for nonstick chemicals in populations exposed through their water supply. I'm going to now address each of these categories of chemicals used in plastic in turn. We know that bisphenols disrupt multiple metabolic mechanisms that contribute to obesity. Bisphenol A, the prototype bisphenol, makes fat cells bigger, disrupts the function of adiponectin, which protects the heart, and is a low-grade synthetic estrogen, and so can have sex-specific effects on body mass. As regulatory attention has focused more on bisphenol A, the chemical industry and plastic industries have substituted bisphenol A with chemically similar replacements. We know, for example, that one replacement, bisphenol S, is as estrogenic, as toxic to embryos, and as persistent in the environment. We know that phthalates come in two general groupings: low molecular weight and high molecular weight. The lower molecular weight phthalates used in shampoos, cosmetics, and lotions tend to antagonize testosterone. The higher molecular weight phthalates tend to directly change the expression of genes that are crucial for lipid and carbohydrate metabolism. We know that phthalates can literally reduce cognitive function in babies by shrinking their brains compared to their peers. And this study shows that the decrease in IQ is explained by the reduction in that brain size. Another important point is that the IQ testing and MRI images, magnetic resonance imaging images, are independent confirmations of the same effect, reinforces the consistency of the scientific evidence from independent observations, and reinforces the likelihood of causality. The effects on brain size are likely explained by decreases in thyroid function presented here due to phthalate exposure. The baby relies on mother's thyroid hormone function through the second trimester of pregnancy. And subtle disruption of thyroid hormone function without obvious clinical changes has been shown to decrease cognitive function and contribute to autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We also know in a large Dutch cohort that these exposures contribute to a overall shrinking of the baby's size. This is important because intrauterine growth restriction can set up a thrifty phenotype in which the baby has a higher risk of keeping calories as fat, thereby contributing to later obesity and heart disease. In this European cohort, phthalates were associated with preterm birth, even though the rate of prematurity was extremely low. Bisphenols were also associated with decreased bone mineral density, which may set the child up for a future of osteoporosis. Looking at the child fat mass, a greater concern, perhaps reflected by the growth restriction and this thrifty phenotype, is the increase in fat around the heart that was identified in relationship to phthalate exposure. So the increase in fat around the heart was directly related to phthalate exposure. And fat around the heart is highly predictive of cardiovascular disease in adulthood. And bisphenol and phthalate exposures in pregnancy were also related to sex-specific effects on blood pressure and triglycerides. Later, in a large US consortium, we confirmed the findings that phthalates were associated with prematurity. What's even more concerning about these findings is that the effect of replacements of di-2-ethyl hexyl phthalate, increasingly used by the plastics industry, were more potent in their effects on prematurity than the chemicals they replaced. And because premature babies require additional medical care and have lower IQs than their peers, the economic consequences, including lost economic productivity, in the US are on the order of $4 billion alone per year. As much as I'm a pediatrician, I have to emphasize that kids are not the only vulnerable population to phthalates. In adults, phthalate exposures have been associated with decreases in testosterone function. And low testosterone is either a predictor of or marker of cardiovascular disease. In a large US sample, we looked at phthalate exposures and subsequent mortality and found increases in cardiovascular mortality in relationship to phthalate exposure. We estimated that 15,000 Americans die each year between the ages of 55 to 64-year-old due to phthalate exposures. And the costs of that lost economic productivity, because these are people in their peak earning years, is $23 billion a year. Bisphenols have also been associated with adult heart disease. They've been associated with increased thickness of the carotid artery that feeds the brain. They've been associated with increased severity of coronary artery disease. And they've also been associated with increases in cardiovascular mortality. And they are also potent risks for diabetes. In a large French cohort, bisphenol A and S, its replacement, were associated with increased risk of incident diabetes. We know that PFAS have been associated again with decreases in birth weight, suggesting intrauterine growth restriction. And subsequent studies have also shown PFAS to be associated with increases in childhood obesity, confirming the thrifty phenotype. We also know that adults are vulnerable. In adults, PFAS have been associated with increases in weight gain and diabetes. I'd like to emphasize one study in which PFAS were measured in adults who had lost weight through healthy diet and physical activity. The PFAS were associated with the weight being gained back more readily. And this weight gain was explained by reductions in the resting metabolic rate. So this just reinforces that nothing in my presentation takes away from the role of diet and physical activity in obesity. It's just that chemicals are an important third factor in the obesity and diabetes pandemics. We also know that over 920 chemicals contribute to breast cancer. And when you cross-reference that list with the list of chemicals used in plastic, over 400 are both breast carcinogens and identified as used in plastic materials. Of these, 300 have no international regulations. We know that PFAS have been associated with increases in breast cancer risk. And multiple studies have suggested that bisphenols and flame retardants have increased the risk of thyroid cancer. And increases in prostate cancer have been associated with bisphenols and phthalates. We know that chemicals used in plastic materials directly contribute to infertility. Phthalates reduce anogenital distance, which is a marker of sex hormone balance. And the anogenital distance you have as an adult is generally the anogenital distance that you have as a child. And phthalates have been particularly associated with lower anogenital distance in boys, suggesting reduced testosterone function. And the disruption of reproductive programming likely sets a child up for reduced semen quality and testosterone levels. And multiple studies have shown adult exposure also to be associated with male infertility. So I'm going to now shift to effects of microplastics. Everywhere we seem to look, we find microplastics in human tissues. And at the same time, this field is in a very early stage of research. There are not yet standard procedures for their measurement, and we need better controls for method development and validation. In particular, the main point that I want to make here that is not in a slide is that there are studies that have already identified microplastics to increase risk for cardiovascular disease. And in particular, there is remarkable consistency with the studies that show the effects of chemicals used in plastic on heart disease. The levels of polyvinyl chloride plastic in the carotid artery of the neck were associated with a 4-fold increase in heart attack, stroke, or death. And because phthalates are widely used in polyvinyl chloride plastic, these results are consistent with the previous study of phthalates and cardiovascular mortality. And so it's less important to focus on the distinction between the effects of microplastics and chemicals used in plastic, and more important to focus on the effects of plastic on human health. And we know that the disease burden due to chemicals used in plastic materials is very substantial. In Europe, the costs of endocrine disrupting chemicals were found to be 163 billion euro a year. And we used rigorous criteria to screen and focus on the effects with the greatest evidence. And yet, this is an extremely conservative estimate because it only focused on a small number of chemicals and small number of effects due to those few chemicals. In the US, these costs are even higher, 340 billion a year, 2% of the gross domestic product. And when you compare the effects in the US and Europe, there are good news and bad news. The costs in the US are much higher due to flame retardants because we added flame retardants to many plastic materials between the 1970s and 2013. The costs due to pesticides in the US, however, are much lower because we required an extra safety factor for children. The main point here is that policies predict exposure. Exposure contributes to disease, and disease ultimately affects us all. And when you add in the costs of PFAS, there are an additional $5 to $62 billion in costs across 13 conditions in the US alone. And when you focus in on the effects globally due to low birth weight, you find that a substantial hundreds of thousands of children are born with low birth weight each year, particularly from regions within Asia. So while there are few data on the effects of chemicals used in plastic beyond the US and Europe, the effects are global and substantial. When you focus in on the costs of the diseases I've described that are specifically due to plastic, they are still extremely substantial. And that's because large proportions of chemical exposures that disrupt hormones are due to plastic. And when you add up all the disease costs I've previously described, the cost of plastic exposure in the US is $250 billion a year alone, 1.2% of our gross domestic product. The irony is that the global revenue of plastic is only $750 billion a year. So the plastic industry is a business that roughly makes $3 in profit for every $1 it damages people in the US alone. So suffice it to say, this is not a very strong business model. And we know that these contribute to disparities based on race and ethnicity as well as income. In low and middle income countries, the disparities are even greater because of contact with plastic through waste picking. Now, what can we do about all of this tragedy? The good news is that there are safe and simple steps that people can take to limit their exposures. We know that you can reduce bisphenol and phthalate exposures in high-income populations within days, and the same changes can be achieved in low-income communities as well. And insofar as these interventions are sustained, you can see medium-term changes in hormone levels and long-term changes in reduced chronic disease. We know that changes in the household environment can also substantially reduce dust levels of the PFAS, the brominated flame retardants, and increasingly replacements used for brominated flame retardants called organophosphorus esters that, again, all derive from plastic materials. We know that there are other steps that we can take to reduce our plastic footprint. Reducing canned food consumption can be very important to reduce BPA exposure. We also need to reduce our food consumption from plastic containers in general. Microwave safe plastic only refers to microwave, not melting plastic in the machine. At a microscopic level, microwaving or machine dishwashing plastic can facilitate the resorption of chemicals and microplastics into food and into the human body. In general, it's important to avoid the use of polyvinyl chloride plastics, typically with the recycling number 3. Polystyrene bottles, typically represented with the number 6 or PS, or the number 7, which include bisphenols. And if plastics are etched or scratched, it's time to throw them away. It's important to also substitute nonstick cooking material with stainless steel or cast iron. And these chemicals can also accumulate in dust, as I alluded to a couple of moments ago. So vacuuming with a HEPA filter or using a wet mop to prevent dust from accumulating can be helpful. So the rest of my presentation is going to focus on policy action to reduce plastic exposures. And I'm going to focus in particular on the steps needed in a global plastics treaty, which is now being negotiated by the United Nations. We are in the midst of a very ambitious process first laid out in March 2022 at the UN Environment Assembly. And in particular, it's important to emphasize that this treaty is intended to address the full life cycle of plastic, not just the waste induced by plastic. A major focus of the debate around the plastics treaty has been whether we need to focus on reduction of plastic, reuse, or recycling of plastic. It's important to emphasize that recycling is energy intensive and more expensive than creating plastic from fossil fuels. And because of contact of plastic materials with other trash, polyethylene plastic bottles that are recycled can actually have higher bisphenols, phthalates, and metals than newly produced bottles. There's been a lot of attention to bioplastics as an alternative to fossil fuel-based plastics, but they actually require an even higher temperature to be recycled, and they produce methane in landfills, which is more potent than CO2 in driving climate change. And the few studies to date suggest that these plastics are actually creating more oxidative stress and antagonism to testosterone. It's important, and due to time, I won't dwell on this too much, to emphasize that we cannot extrapolate from high dose experiments in animals to low dose levels in humans when it comes to chemicals used in plastic. And allow me to just emphatically point out that very few chemicals used in plastic, only 128 have been regulated globally. So this plastics treaty is a crucial vehicle for regulating chemicals and particularly examining the effects of low-level exposures, which have typically not been addressed well through regulation. We need to particularly measure these chemicals in low and middle income countries where exposures are rapidly increasing. And through this treaty, we suggest the need for a new international agency like we have for cancer, recognizing the emerging science of endocrine disruption. In particular, we acknowledge that from an efficiency perspective, this treaty process could also have the agency focus not just on plastics, but pesticides, given the known effects on the endocrine system. So just to make my closing comments, we need a global plastics treaty that ultimately reduces plastic production. We do not have the safety system to evaluate plastics as they're currently used. We need to recognize the hazards posed by recycling and use of bioplastics. We need to increasingly use hazard rather than risk, because we cannot extrapolate from high dose exposures in animals to low dose exposures in humans. We need to remove endocrine disrupting chemicals from plastic. We need to expand biomonitoring programs globally because low and middle income countries are increasingly exposed. And we need an independent scientific body to evaluate the hazards of chemicals used in plastic. And I will leave you with this haunting memory of a plastic person, because this increasingly represents the human form. Arigato gozaimasu, and I look forward to your questions.